Chapter 3. John sat across from Rich at their usual spot in the ivy, where the dark wood paneling and soft Art Deco lights cast a warm, intimate glow over the tables. Outside the window, Covent Garden bustled with its usual energy. The faint sounds of street musicians mingling with laughter and the low hum of conversations from tourists and locals alike. Inside, the restaurant's lively buzz felt familiar yet oddly removed, like a stage set he was watching from the wings. The table was set with crisp linens and gleaming silverware, the understated elegance that had once felt like home. But now, sitting here amid the low murmur, the occasional burst of laughter, and the quiet clink of glassware, John found himself feeling slightly detached, as if he were looking at it all through someone else's eyes. Across from him, Rich was fully in his element, leaning forward with a grin, gesturing animatedly over the polished mahogany table. His gray-flecked hair was meticulously styled, and a hint of cologne mixed with the scent of freshly polished wood and the faint tang of citrus from the bar. Rich leaned in, elbows on the table, his expression sparking with excitement. "Glad you could make it. All right, here it is," he said, his voice dropping with the air of a grand reveal. "Something very different, compelling. Maybe even a bit edgy." John raised an eyebrow, feigning casual interest, though Rich's enthusiasm cut through his disinterest. "All right, Rich, what's the subject? Have you ever heard of a thing called Fatima?" Rich asked, almost lowering his voice, as if the name itself held weight. John furrowed his brow. "No, doesn't ring a bell," he said, reaching for the menu, half listening. Rich leaned in closer, eyes glinting. "A series of apparitions of the Virgin Mary, Portugal, 1917. Hundreds, maybe thousands, of people claiming to witness the supernatural healings, the sun dancing in the sky." "All of it," John blinked, setting the menu down. He was more curious than he let on. "You want me to cover a miracle?" "Not quite," Rich said, leaning back with a grin. "That's the beauty of it. The publisher wants an outsider's perspective, a secular, skeptical voice, your voice. With your name recognition, they win just by having you on board. They want someone who can dig in and explore without leaning too far toward belief or debunking. Just a bit of nosing around, capturing the experience." John took a slow sip of his coffee, letting the idea settle. It was intriguing, a project he'd have jumped at once, but that felt like a lifetime ago. "And they need me there in person?" Rich nodded, his smile broadening. "That's the beauty of it. They're looking for someone who'll go on site and get immersed. It's in Portugal, not far from Lisbon, easily drivable. Plus, the anniversary's coming up, October 13th. They want you there as soon as possible." John felt a flicker of anticipation, though he kept his expression steady. The invitation to leave, to step into a world so different from his own, held a strange appeal. "I'll think about it," he said finally, meeting Rich's expectant gaze. "It'd be quite a departure from my usual writing." Rich chuckled, satisfied. "Departure's just what you need. Besides, it'd be good to get out of London for a few days, maybe a week or two." "There is that," John said, allowing himself a small smile. "Good enough, but don't sit on it too long. Projects like this don't stay on offer forever." Rich's tone was light, but his eyes held a glint of persuasion. John's mind drifted, the thought of stepping out of London resonating somewhere deeper than he'd expected. "I ran into Simon the other night. Said he'd mentioned my name to someone at Penguin. Apparently, they're interested in something new," John added, as if testing Rich's reaction. "I'll give him a call," Rich replied, unfazed. "But remember, one in the hand is better than two in the bush." He leaned back, giving John a knowing look. John scanned the menu, settling on a quiche and a cranberry juice. "Actually, October 13th would be a good time for me to be out of town." "Rachel?" Rich asked, his tone softening. "I haven't seen her around lately. You haven't been to the usual parties recently. Plenty of people I'd like to introduce you to." "Yeah, things are strained," John said, choosing his words carefully. "We're coexisting mostly. It all started after the kids left." Rich chuckled knowingly. "Mine left 8 years ago. You'll find your rhythm. In the meantime, think about the offer and let me know this week." John nodded, but his thoughts were already elsewhere, somewhere between the restaurant and a place he couldn't yet define. "I will." John arrived early for his date with Delilah, stepping into the dim warmth of the Soho restaurant with a quiet anticipation that felt both familiar and foreign. The place was small, intimate, a tucked-away spot that carried an aura of something timeless, a weariness at the edges of things, as though it held secrets from a half-century of quiet rendezvous. Low lights cast amber glows over dark wood tables, their surfaces scratched and polished smooth by years of use. Exposed brick walls, slightly chipped, framed the space with an unforced charm, while flickering candles glinted off mismatched glasses. He took his seat in a small leather booth against the wall, the seat low and yielding beneath him. He let his fingers trail over the worn armrest, feeling the smoothness of leather that had been rubbed down by 100 others before him. Across the room, the bartender poured a neat whiskey, the amber liquid catching the candlelight in fractured bursts before it vanished into a customer's hand. John ordered the same, letting the familiar warmth of the whiskey rest at the back of his throat as he sat back, observing the room. It was the sort of place one could imagine settling into indefinitely. A place without time. John looked around, noting the quiet details, a faint line of dust on the bottles on a high shelf, the way the candlelight seemed to dim the air itself, casting shadows that were just a little deeper. He felt an unfamiliar thrill, that strange rush of being untethered, waiting in the gentle haze of candlelight for a woman he didn't yet know. A few minutes passed, and then she arrived. Delilah slipped through the entrance like a whisper, her coat open over a soft cashmere sweater, hair brushing her shoulders in a way that seemed both intentional and untouched. She moved with a natural grace, a quiet sense of ease, and when she saw him, her face softened in a smile, a gentle, slow curve that made him feel, for a brief moment, that they'd known each other much longer. "John," she said, her voice smooth, unhurried, as though she were letting each syllable settle in the air. "Delilah." He rose slightly from his seat, an old habit he barely remembered he'd had. They shook hands, hers soft and cool, lingering just a second longer than necessary. They both sat, settling into the warm cushions of the booth, and the silence between them felt thick, not awkward but expectant. The quiet of two people sizing each other up without even knowing they were doing so. The first few moments passed easily, their conversation drifting through small details, her recent travels, a book she'd read that she loved enough to carry in her bag. As she spoke, he watched the way her fingers traced the edge of her wine glass, her eyes flickering toward the entrance every so often, as though she were constantly absorbing the world around her, evaluating it. "So Simon tells me you're the real deal." "Writer, bestsellers, a man of ideas," she teased, her eyes glinting with the faintest challenge. "Real deal's an overstatement," he replied, smiling wryly. "I just know how to put words together without tripping over them." Mostly, she leaned forward, her gaze intent. "I can't tell if you're modest or just practiced at self-deprecation." "Maybe a bit of both. Sometimes I think the words have a mind of their own," John said, surprised by his own candor. "Good," she said, nodding. "I like people who don't feel the need to hide behind an act." There was a pause, and John felt a flicker of something, anticipation perhaps, a sense of an opening he hadn't expected. He let the moment hang, unwilling to fill it just yet, content to feel the weight of it. They ordered, her cocktail sharp with gin and lime, his whiskey dark and smoky. The conversation continued, winding through books and thoughts on travel, and at one point, London itself. She spoke with a voice that was both steady and light, each sentence weaving an impression of her that seemed vivid, carefully defined, yet somehow still elusive. John found himself absorbed in her cadence, the way she let her words drift, their meaning growing subtly, as if she wanted to leave parts of herself unspoken. She looked at him directly, a faint curiosity in her eyes that was rare, refreshing. She didn't fill the air with flattery or eager interest, nor did she tread cautiously. She was comfortable in the silence, allowing him to speak, to lead or retreat as he chose. "You seem like you've been around the world and back," she said, taking a sip of her cocktail. "Are you still looking for something, or have you found it?" The question caught him off guard, a shade more serious than he'd expected. "Not sure," he replied, a little too quickly. "Still piecing it together, I suppose." "Good answer," she said, leaning back, her fingers toying with the edge of her glass. Sometimes I think people answer those things too quickly, like they have to have everything figured out. It's always the quiet ones who end up with something more interesting to say. He chuckled, letting his gaze drift over her face, the candlelight casting her features in soft lines, adding a depth he couldn't quite define. There was something enigmatic in her expression, something inviting, yet just out of reach. Her laugh was soft, catching the air around her in a way that felt almost unintentional, as though her own joy was surprising even to her. As the evening wore on, she tilted her head, her eyes narrowing with a playful smile. "So what's next for you, John? Any exciting plans or just the London routine?" He hesitated, feeling the weight of the evening settle in, the glass in his hand a little heavier. "Actually, there's something. A work trip, maybe. Portugal." "Portugal?" She raised an eyebrow, her curiosity piqued. "What's there? Sand, sea, or some hidden mystery?" He shrugged, choosing his words carefully. "A bit of everything. I'll be looking into an old story. An anniversary, actually, of something people believe they saw. A miracle of sorts." "A miracle," she echoed, her tone light yet probing. "You don't strike me as the religious type." "I'm not," he said, his voice measured. "But sometimes things come along that invite you to look closer." Her eyes held his for a beat too long, a flicker of amusement there, as though she'd caught some unspoken hint of doubt. "I like that," she said, her voice softening. "The possibility of things. It's so rare these days." They drifted into silence, each moment taking on a gravity he hadn't expected, an ease that felt dangerously close to familiarity. She looked away briefly, glancing around the room with a half-smile, as if savoring something she couldn't quite name. "You know," she said finally, her voice low, "I was thinking. Maybe we could get out of the city. I don't mean to be too forward, but for the weekend if you're interested. There's a trail I've been wanting to try out in the peaks, and I have a friend who can get me a cabin rental. Nothing fancy, but it's real untouched." Her words hung between them, an invitation that seemed larger than the moment. He wanted to say yes, to slip into her world, to leave London for a stretch of uncharted days and explore. But somewhere within him, a small doubt stirred, a sense of something not quite settling, like sand that wouldn't sink. Was he really ready to accept the arrangement with Rachel, to go wherever the wind blew? "I'd like that," he said, feeling the truth of it and yet hedging with, "if I can manage. This work thing, it might need me sooner than I'd planned." She smiled, her eyes studying him. "Well, consider it an open offer. I'm patient, you know." They lingered a while longer, the edges of the evening softening, folding in on themselves as they spoke of little things, favorite writers, films, small places in the city that felt like refuge. But the weight of her invitation lingered, like a tether that drew him back even as he tried to drift. At last they rose, and Delilah held his gaze, the slightest hesitation in her movements, as though debating whether to close the distance between them. Instead, she offered a hand, her fingers cool and soft in his. They left the restaurant, and he walked her home through the damp chill of the evening, speaking of her work in home decorating, finding it easy to listen. She was everything he could want. What was his hang-up? Outside her building, she turned to him, a faint smile on her lips. "Thank you for a very pleasant evening," she said softly. And then, closing the distance, she kissed him, her lips lingering on his, warm and inviting. He didn't resist, pulling her closer and letting the moment pass through him like an old memory. She was perfect, certainly perfect on paper, he thought, and yet. He walked back through the city, letting the night pull him in, wondering, as he often did, if he was the one out of place or if the world itself had shifted, slightly out of reach. John stood outside his mother's modest flat in Hampstead, a quiet pocket of North London where the charm of old London still lingered, the narrow streets lined with terraced houses and trees just starting to turn with the crisp colors of autumn. Her flat was in one of those sturdy red brick buildings, built in the 1930s, with a small square of lawn bordered by neatly trimmed hedges and a single oak tree casting long shadows over the cracked sidewalk. He felt the chill of the morning settle into his bones, clutching a couple of grocery bags in one hand, an offering for their weekly visit. There was a comforting ordinariness to the building, a sense of being rooted in a city that often felt as if it were always on the move. The familiar scent of damp leaves and morning mist hung in the air as he paused by the old iron gate, feeling the quiet weight of memories wash over him. His mother's home used to be his home, a fixed point he could return to, regardless of how many turns his life had taken. Through the front windows, he could just make out the edges of the worn curtains she refused to replace, their faded floral pattern catching the first hints of light. He took a breath, adjusted his grip on the bags, and made his way to the front door. He glanced down at his phone, scrolling through the messages he hadn't quite gathered the energy to answer yet. Delilah's bright text about having confirmed the availability of the cabin, and Rachel's more subdued, open-ended invitation. She'd mentioned she was staying with girlfriends on the Anglian coast, even hinted that he was welcome to come if he wanted. Then there was Rich's reminder that the publisher was hoping for an answer today if possible. He felt a familiar tightening in his chest, a mixture of yearning and resistance, but he shoved the phone back into his pocket and knocked. "John," his mother's voice greeted him, frail but full of warmth. She opened the door and ushered him in, her eyes sparking with surprise as she noticed the grocery bags. "You spoil me, you know that?" Inside, the familiar scent of lavender and old paper wrapped around him like an embrace. Her flat was cozy and modest but brimming with warmth, cluttered with the small mementos she'd collected over the years, many of them from his childhood, a stack of postcards he'd sent from Paris in his 20s, a shelf of his first editions, a few chipped seashells from Brighton. Overflowing bookshelves lined the walls, with paperbacks and hardcovers alike, some piled in precarious towers along the floor. The space was a testament to her life, and John felt both comforted and a pang of envy at the steadiness of it all. He followed her into the kitchen, setting the bags down on the counter. "Just a few things you mentioned," he said, unpacking bread, milk, the tea she liked, and a new mystery novel he'd picked up on a whim. "Thought you might enjoy this one." "Oh, you know me too well," she said with a wink, taking the book from his hands. "Though I have to tell you, I'm on a bit of a poetry kick lately. Robert Frost, if you can believe it." She reached into her cardigan pocket and pulled out a dog-eared copy of Frost's collected works, its cover worn smooth. John chuckled, turning to fill the kettle. "I didn't know you had a poetic streak." "Oh, please," she laughed, waving him off. "I was reading poetry before you were out of nappies." She thumbed through the pages, stopping at a spot she'd marked. "Do you know this one? The Road Not Taken? Your father used to say it was his favorite." John nodded, the familiar lines already threading through his mind. She adjusted her reading glasses and smiled, her voice soft yet clear as she read. "Two roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference." She closed the book with a thoughtful sigh, looking at him as if seeing something deeper. "Life is really just a series of forks in the road, isn't it? Sometimes I wonder if I took the right ones." John wrapped his hands around the warm mug, looking at her with a thoughtful smile. "And which one is the right one, then?" Her eyes twinkled as she held up the worn copy of Frost. "Well, Frost tells it, doesn't he? The road less traveled by. That's the one that makes all the difference. We don't always know it at the time, but looking back. Sometimes you just feel it." He sat with her words, letting them sink in, feeling her wisdom and calm wash over him. The night before drifted back to him, the easy way Delilah had looked at him, her invitation to get out of the city, and her fleeting, almost carefree talk about living in the moment. But in the cold light of morning, those words felt hollow, a shiny distraction from something deeper he knew he was missing. He glanced at his phone, aware of Rachel's message waiting there, a suggestion more than an invitation. She wasn't demanding anything, just leaving the door open for him to join her on the Anglian coast if he chose. The ambiguity made him uneasy, as if a shift had occurred between them that he hadn't noticed before. He wondered if she wanted him to meet her friends, to play the role of the writer husband she used to be proud of. Another buzz interrupted his thoughts, this time a message from Daniel, his son. "Dad, should I go after Julie or give her space? I don't know what she wants. Maybe it's better if I just let it go." John stared at the message, seeing the pleading edge in Daniel's words, as if his son were looking to him for clarity. He couldn't find himself. His mother looked up, her gaze catching the shift in his expression. Something wrong? She asked, her voice gentle, yet perceptive as ever. Just life, I suppose, he hesitated, then added. Julie left Daniel. She took the kids to her mother's, and he doesn't know what to do. And then there's a work thing in Portugal I haven't committed to yet. And Rachel, she's by the coast. She reached across the table, her fingers wrapping around his hand. You'll make the right decision, John. And so will Daniel. He nodded, grateful for her quiet reassurance. But as he rose to leave, her words and the lines from Frost seemed to follow him, threading together the strange pull of each choice, each fork in the road, each step toward or away from something he couldn't quite name. Outside, the morning air felt sharper, crisper, as if waiting to make him choose. He looked down at his phone once more, feeling the weight of 3 options. Rachel with the comfort and familiarity of a shared history, Delilah with her inviting thrill and the allure of something fresh, and Portugal offering an unknown journey, solitude, and perhaps a reconnection to something he'd lost. Or he could drive to Daniel, try to offer some fatherly advice to guide him through his own crossroads. He tucked the phone back into his pocket, feeling the echo of Frost's words like a compass point he hadn't yet decided to follow. And as he walked back down the quiet street, he felt somehow that whatever road he chose next would indeed make all the difference. John closed the door of his mother's flat, stepping into the cool morning air with a weighty sense of indecision pressing on him. Each path felt like a tug, pulling him in different directions with an intensity that lingered on his mind. His car was parked a few streets down, and as he walked toward it, he absently pulled out his phone to check his messages. Rachel's text was there, calm and open-ended, but lacking any warmth. He could picture himself slipping away to East Anglia, joining her by the coast, the easy familiarity between them a quiet refuge. But as he arrived home and crossed the entryway, his gaze fell to her wedding ring, still lying on the small side table. It hadn't moved, and that small gleaming circle of metal brought a sharp sting of anger, an unmistakable reminder of all she had taken lightly. Shoving his phone back into his pocket, he turned instead to thoughts of Delilah, her ease and invitation lingering. The thrill of an uncomplicated escape was tempting, promising nothing to question or regret. He pulled out his phone again, ready to confirm with her, thumb hovering over her name. But he stopped, hesitating. Wasn't he about to step into the very thing he'd spent a year recoiling from? His mother's words drifted back to him alongside Frost's lines. He looked around at the empty house, the silent walls seeming to hold his indecision. The road less taken. The thought brought a strange clarity, pointing him toward a choice he hadn't fully considered until now. Portugal, not as an escape, but as a space to gain perspective. He opened a message to Delilah. I'll be gone for a week or so. Had a lovely time with you, and would love to continue where we left off when I return. It wasn't a final answer, but it was a start, a way to keep things open without letting her presence shape his decision. Almost as an afterthought, he responded to Daniel's message, typing in the lines from Frost his mother had read. 2 roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. Grandma's advice, if that helps any, he added, smiling faintly as he hit send. Then he messaged Rich, tell the publisher I'm in. Send over the contract and details, I'll sign. In his office, he waited for the paperwork to arrive and picked up his first bestseller, The Last Honest Man, opening it at random. His eyes fell on a line he'd nearly forgotten. The truest betrayal is not what we do to others, but what we do to the person we once swore we'd never become. The words struck him anew, as if an echo from his younger self, and he remembered the day he'd written them, sitting in a cafe and people-watching, waiting for a spark to move his character forward. Then his phone buzzed again, an unknown number flashing on the screen. John frowned, thumb hovering, and opened the message. Sometimes the hardest path is the one you know you need to walk alone. See you in Fatima. He reread the line twice, feeling a chill run through him. It was from the book he was holding, his book. His hands tightened around the phone as he texted back. I see you've read my book. I look forward to writing this one. Who is this? The response came quickly. Anna Whitaker. I'm your co-author. I just heard you gave a verbal yes to the project. You won't regret it.